Hello and welcome to Mandibil. Okay, so I'm going to do a little comment on Carl Benjamin, also known as Sargon of Akkad, or at least that's how he used to be known. I'm not quite sure what name he goes under at the moment. And the channel he is talking from now is called lotuseaters.com. And what I'm going to talk to you about is Hume's law, and also known as Hume's Isought divide or Hume's Isought distinction. It has many names. So what I'm always trying to figure out is when people claim that they either don't accept the law or the rule, how they get to moral judgments, and if they get to moral judgment, are they actually violating what Hume is trying to say? So I think I'll just head into starting the video, and it's a 7.5 minute long, so it shouldn't take more than a few hours at most to comment on this, but let's see how it goes.
I made in passing on a podcast recently about how I don't really agree with Hume's law. And I've had a bunch of people asking me why that is the case, and could I explain it? So for anyone who doesn't know, David Hume was an 18th century Scottish Enlightenment philosopher who coined a term which has become famously known as Hume's law or Hume's guillotine, which is you can't derive an ought from an is, as in simply because something is a fact does not mean we ought to do something about it. The sky is blue. Are we obligated to do something about that? The answer is no. This is a very useful intellectual tool for separating factual statements from moral statements.
This is a quite simplistic or slightly confused understanding of what Hume is trying to say. It seems that people get hung up on this term ought and feel that it's sort of a any kind of moral judgment is hung upon the word ought, and if you can argue against the ought and find some other term instead of ought, then you have sort of, put Hume aside because he's the guy with the ought word, right? What he's trying to say is if you read the quote in a Treatise of Human Nature, he's phrasing it like, I don't receive any description that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. It is connected with an ought. So the ought is a placeholder for all kinds of moral justifications of any kind, like you should or you ought or you must, or it's a commandment, whatever it is. He can't list all the moral words used in his contemporary times and all those that has appeared since then, right? Or those who have been forgotten in the past or whatever. So he's sort of conflating all moral judgments into an idea of ought, but is sort of connected with an ought. So you should see it like ought is a placeholder for any kind of morally laden description, right? And what Hume points out is that what people tend to do, which nobody seemed to really have realized the significance of before Hume, and it's still haunting us because it's so frequent that people just jump this Isought as if it's just, they don't even know that they're jumping the Isought without having any justification for it, right? He is just saying that if you want to make a moral judgment or moral rule or principle or anything that is moral, you can't just describe the world and then say, therefore you should do or should not do this, right? It's this jumping from I'm experiencing this to all of a sudden saying you should do this, right? That's the problem. But another thing that you might want to dig into also is that Hume is not saying, as many people claim, that he says, or he doesn't say that you cannot bridge the gap. He doesn't say that. To him, it's inconceivable, but he doesn't say you can't bridge the gap. All he's trying to point out is that if you're jumping the gap, you must explain how you do it. To him, it's inconceivable. And it apparently has been inconceivable for everybody else since then. So you just have to point out what you're doing. How do you bridge the gap? How does that moral judgment all of a sudden appear? How do you get to that? Is it just your purely subjective, only emotional attachment to what goes on in the outside that is the moral foundations for you to tell other people how to act? Then it's only your sort of opinion, and that's what he is against, because he's an empiricist, right? As you should be, in my opinion. And he says, well, if you're telling people what to do, you are telling them how to act in an empirical world, but that action you're trying to control them into is only created from your pure subjective opinion. And that doesn't work, right? Well, it works. You can do it, and people might follow you, and if you threaten them with violence like the state does, they may actually do what you tell them because they're afraid to be killed. But that doesn't make it philosophy, right? Or good philosophy, or correct philosophy.
Because one of the things you might notice in your own life is that people are very, very, very quick to combine moral and factual statements into the same category and act as...
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was what Hume was pointing out, or he observed that just seemed to, this is the case, this is the case, and this is the case, and therefore you should, right?
As if the way that people wish things should be is the way that things actually are. And
well, that's an important point you are getting at there. You're trying to explain what they're actually doing, and I think you are on a good path there. You're actually, what people are doing is they envision a situation from a prior agreed upon situation or state of affairs or state of reality or whatever you want to call it, and then thing has moved in a direction that is kind of unwanted, and from that previous situation, things could have gone another way, and this could be in a different situation depending on whatever human interaction was the case or was not the case or whatever, right? So people are saying, okay, it could have been different. If you have acted back then in this or that or the other way, it would have been different, and that would have been better for whatever situation, right? But the situation now is what is the case, and it can't be changed, because it is the case, right? So I think there might be some slight weakness in what Hume talks about, because he seems to be talking about is, and that is in the now. But what people are sort of putting together is both from the past and their imaginations of how it could be and how things are and how people acted back then, how they're acting now. And it's sort of a big conglomeration of all sorts of imaginations and both memories and imaginations of how things, even if they're bad now, they might turn out even worse if you do not change your actions and so on. So I would have wanted Hume to write a whole book about this topic, but it's just a small, slightly small quote in his book, Treatise of Human Nature. So,
and Hume was pointing out that this just wasn't the case. It is useful, because if we're not precise in our thinking, we could end up with some quite terrible results. Sloppy thinking can lead to bad outcomes, especially as ought is quite a soft word. You ought to do this, you ought to do that.
Yeah, but don't be too hung up on that word, right? He says that things are connected with an ought, which means ought should be used in a generalized term. It's not the everyday use of the word ought, you ought to do this. It's a catch-all word for any kind of moral judgment following a series of is statements, right? Or not necessarily is, but when you analyze descriptions, you will realize that they're basically just the descriptions of how things are. And from how things are or how things were just a few minutes ago or, yesterday or whatever, doesn't justify a conclusion on how things should be now or in the near future. So that's the crux of what he's trying to say. Just looking at how things are or were does not mean that you can draw a conclusion about how to act or tell other people to act. And it's that pure jump from descriptions of the world to behaviors in the world that is the problem. He doesn't say that you can't judge the world from how it is to how you should act. He's just saying you can't just jump over and just pretend that you have figured out something, because you haven't. You haven't explained how you just added this description of actions. And don't get too hung up on the word ought.
But it leads on to stronger imperatives such as should, shall, and must, which all grow out of this same view.
But these ideas of the strength of a word, that's stupid, right? It doesn't matter what word you use, right? It doesn't. A word doesn't create anything. It's just a sound you make with your throat, right? It doesn't change anything in the world, and it doesn't affect your actions unless you are being manipulated by these words to change the way you thought you would act, right? So that's the kind of manipulation that I'm even more concerned with than bridging Hume's Isought gap, which is of course also important. But it's that, don't look at Hume, look at how I'm phrasing my words so they sound very important, and therefore you should. That's even more bullshit than Hume, right?
And this is why we should be precise in the way we think about these things. And obviously, these words are used often in non-moral contexts, but Hume is specifically talking about the moral ones. But to explain why I think Hume is wrong here comes from a book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong by John Mackey, an Australian 20th century philosopher. And he uses the example of institutions, not necessarily formal institutions, a building you can visit, a person you can speak to, but institutions that are, say, we could just call social institutions. And these can be...
Institutions doesn't exist, right? Only buildings exist, only people exist. This is not even empirical. It has to be empirical for you to be able to apply Hume's Isought gap. You can't. Does a social institution have a color? Does it have a taste? Does it have a sound, a feel, or whatever, right? No, it doesn't. So it doesn't exist. So you can't even apply Hume's Isought gap because there's nothing to be the is thing, right? Just be aware that you have been fooled into believing that something like a social institution is something that exists and should be cared about, right? And should be obeyed or whatever, right?
Rituals that we have, these can be games that we play, things like this. In fact, a really good example of this is the game of chess. I could play a game of chess with someone who I don't even share a language with, because the rules of chess are so ubiquitous, it's such an old game, and everyone knows how it's supposed to be played, that the rules of the institution are present in people's understanding when we both sit down at the chessboard, even if...
But nobody says you should follow the rules of chess. You can crap all over the plate and you jump on it or throw the pieces at the face of the other guy. Who says you have to follow it? Right? It might be that the other guy or girl says, well, then I'm not going to play chess with you. All right, then so be it, right? But if you want to follow the rules, you follow the rules. If you don't want to follow the rules, don't follow the rules. Who says you have to? There's no ought there, right? There is no ought, right? You're trying to, because somebody in the far past has set down, written some rules somewhere, and all of a sudden everybody will automatically follow this. Bullshit, right? Bullshit. Rules are just, this is what I think. I think you should do this. Who says you can create your own rules for chess? Who cares, right? You might care about it. You might want to play chess with somebody who really want to follow those kinds of rules that have been set for chess some time back, right? But nobody says it has to follow those rules. Rules are just opinions, right? Just like any other kind of opinion. There has to be, the chess rules didn't come down from the heavens and, were written on tablets from God or something like that. And that is also bullshit, right? But they have been created by subjective human beings. I think this is how it should be played. But who are they to decide how to play chess, right? Make up your own rules.
If I can't even say hello to the guy, when he makes his first move, I know that he'll move a rook forward, a pawn forward 2 pieces, 2 squares, and I'll...
No, you don't. You don't know what he's going to do. Bullshit. You don't know the future. And another thing is, epistemologically, you cannot know what the future holds until it becomes the now, and then it's no longer the future, right? The future is an epistemologically black area, black box. You have no knowledge of the future because knowledge of the future is impossible. You can have ideas, you can have theories, you can have, Newton's laws and, whatever law, scientific and other kinds of laws that says that it's very likely that this is going to happen based on what has happened before and what the case is right now, right? But that doesn't mean you know it, right? Now you're saying you know what is going to happen. No, you don't.
Know that he understands the rules of chess and we will automatically fall into playing it.
But even if he knows the so-called rules of chess, how do you know he's going to do it? You are willing to take the chance that he's going to abide the same rules that you think you know about how chess should be played. How do you know that they're the right rules, right? Because you were told by somebody else or you wrote it in a book or something. But that's not knowledge, right? A rule can never be knowledge. It's a way to systematize things in a certain way. And it's a set of predefined actions that is described by somebody else, right? It's not knowledge. It's not an object. It can't be objectified, so it can't be knowledge. It's a system. It's like Newton's law that predicts or attempts to predict what is going to happen if you jump from the Eiffel Tower, right?
It as we understand it. And so this is what can be described as an institution. It's got established rules, it's got established norms and customs and behaviors surrounding it that are well known. And so from the institution of chess, we actually, from the
institution of chess? What the hell are you talking about? Some guy in the 1600 or something wrote down, cut some pieces and says, this is the pieces I've made. I made a game here, right? And you should move it this way or that way. Is that an institution? Where is that institution, right? If you want to moralize and compare to Hume's Isought gap, you need to empirically be able to point to an object and say, that is what is. And judging how things are is by claiming, or at least pointing to color, taste, sound, the 5 senses, right? The 5 senses. If it doesn't have any sense data, or you can't, with somebody else near you and point and say, that's such a kind of thing, and it has this color and that color, and it has whatever, then it doesn't exist. And if it doesn't exist, it can't be is. And if it can't be is, Hume's law doesn't apply, right?
That is the institution of chess and our shared understanding of what a game of chess is. We actually can derive a whole bunch of oughts or shoulds or musts.
You are not deriving them. You're just saying, if you want to follow the chess rules. This is what you have to do. You can say that it's an ought, but you're just saying, if you want to follow the rules, these are the rules, right? It's not an ought. What's an ought? It's a moral judgment. Why is it all of a sudden a moral judgment? Why would it be immoral to not follow the moving around the pieces? Because you are fixated on these rules and laws and social whatever. But what's going on in the real world is just pieces of wood that are moved in certain ways. And you're describing these objects and saying these objects, this is how they are, but this is how they should be, these objects, right? You're actually violating Hume's Isought gap, right? Trying to circumvent it by saying, oh, there are these, social conventions and laws and rules and so on. And if you're not obeying these rules, you ought to obey them. Bullshit.
That we could express as imperatives if the context warranted it. Ought just merely being a reason that an agent should do something, can do something. In fact, no, should do something is more applicable in whichever political context, particular context. So, I mean, I could say something like, you must not move your rook diagonally, the rook being the castle piece that only moves up and down or left and right. But maybe I could say you should move your queen to check the king, or you can't move your knight in a straight line.
Of course you can't.
Because the rules are the rules.
Excuse me. Of course you can. People can do whatever they want. Huh? Who are you to tell me how to move my little pieces of wood on some cardboard? Why are you telling me what to do, right? No. But then the point is rather that if you want to engage with other people, you need to agree upon the rules of engagement, right? The rules of engagement is what creates a potential ought. And if that ought is not followed, it's not your task to force other people to follow the ought that you think is there, but that you retire from the engagement, right? That you retire from, that you pull away and say, okay, I'm not going to play chess anymore, right? We agreed upon these rules. Now you're not following the rules. Okay, fine. You don't want to follow the rules. Then I don't want to play chess. And then you back off and say, I'm not going to engage with this guy anymore. That's what you do, right? But this kind of, you should do this, you should do that. It's like a sort of a semi-sadistic streak that people want to enforce rules to control them. It's sort of very deep psychological thing that people should be forced to follow these rules because these rules have been made, right? That's a fallacy. What you should do is say, okay, before we start to do this, the rules of engagement between you and me, we are going to play chess. Do you want to play chess? Okay, yes, I want to play chess. Okay, do we agree about these rules about chess? These rules that, you can read the book or the rule set or whatever. Are we going to follow that rule? Yes. And I even know that there's slight little things that you can agree on how to play chess. There are little things. It's been a while since I played chess, but there are certain, if there's a gambit or there are a few things where you can, okay, we can agree on a slight diversion from the sort of the set rules, but if we agree upon them, it's the same for both of us. That doesn't mean that somebody else over there has to follow the rules, right? But if you agree with this guy that the queen can only go one step at a time, okay, well then it's the same for both of you, right? But that doesn't mean that you ought to follow whatever rule somebody else says, right? It doesn't even mean that you or the other guys have to follow the rules. But what it doesn't either mean is that if somebody else breaks the rule, that you have to keep engaging and follow the rules, right? Either you can say, okay, I'm going to break the rules the same way you break the rules, or you're going to say, I'm not participating in this engagement anymore, and pull out. And you are probably going to say, I'm never going to play chess with that guy anymore, right? And going to tell everybody in your surroundings about this stupid idiot who craps all over the chessboard, right?
and drawing from a shared understanding and endorsement of the rules of chess, which I assume that we're endorsing implicitly because we sit down to play a game of chess. So I can actually ascribe a kind of authority to myself to make these imperative statements. And it's not just in non-moral contexts that we have these institutions. The example that John Mackey gives is a really, really good one. I found it very, very persuasive. Moral institutions like this also exist, such as the institution of making a promise. This is not something that you can point to. It's not something that's been incorporated anywhere, but everyone everywhere accepts that there is an institution called a promise.
There isn't an institution. It's not something that is. Show me a picture of an institution, right? It can't be some other object. It can't be a building. It can't be a person, because that is already identified with another concept, right? So show me a unique concept you can point to that is a thing like that. But you can't, right? So you're referring to things that doesn't exist in order to create rules about how things that do exist should be ordered when people engage with them. So you're just constantly violating Hume's Isought gap, thinking that you are trying to eliminate it.
So if I promised to do something for you, you would have a justified expectation of me to fulfill that promise later down the line.
Yes, I might have an expectation that if I agree to you, if I say, I promise I'm going to follow the rules of chess, and then I start to knock the pieces over and crap on the board and whatever, so what? What should be possible is for you to say, I don't want to participate in this anymore, and retract your engagement, right? But you don't want to do that. You want to be the guy who says to the other guy, no, I will force you to follow the rules that I have set, right? That's why you want a state. That's why you can't see any solutions to problems of social character without the state enforcing some kind of rule that people must obey, right? This is a very deep psychological problem that you are trying to circumvent this way. Letting people be free to choose whether or not they want to engage is impossible when you have a state, right? Because the state forces you to participate by economic value, by your taxation. You are forced to associate with people you don't necessarily want to associate with. People, making abortions, people creating nuclear weapons, people creating whatever bullshit it is, right? Single mothers en masse, right? I don't want to participate in that, but there are rules I must obey, right? You don't want me to be able to say, no, I don't want to participate anymore. I'm retracting my engagement. But you don't want people to be able to retract their engagement. So you need there to be rules, and people must follow them, right? And thereby you are violating Hume's Isought gap. Just be aware of what you're saying, right?
Fine. So, for example, if I promise to pay John £5, and I've made this promise to pay £5, therefore we can say that I've placed myself under an obligation to pay £5. And since it is the case that I am now under this obligation, I ought.
You're not under an obligation. You just promised somebody something. There's no obligation anywhere. That didn't suddenly appear an obligation somewhere, except maybe in your head, that there's just some guy who said something that some other guys thought that, well, in the future this is going to happen. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, and it doesn't mean that guy is going to follow that, right? It doesn't follow. You keep violating Hume's Isought gap, thinking that you are, eliminating it.
To pay John £5. If I'd previously borrowed £5 from John, we can quite securely say that this is now a moral imperative, as now I actually have a debt.
But there isn't any imperative. There's no morality. You just sort of, by using words, all of a sudden, and then morality appears, right? Then morality, right? Whee! Bullshit. You are violating Hume's Isought, right? You have not explained how you all of a sudden get to that morality. You think you are bridging the gap by saying there are these rules over here. Somebody wrote some rules and you're not following them, but you ought to, right? But those rules were made by somebody violating Hume's Isought gap, right? Ah,
to him that I previously borrowed, and so any reasonable observer understanding this situation could just quite simply say to me that there is an ought from the establishment of the is, that I owe John £5, that I ought to pay him that £5 back.
But an ought is not something that exists. That's the whole point of Hume. It doesn't exist. You can't point to an ought, right? There is no ought anywhere, right? You can't say that. It's your imagination. You're afraid of people being able to pull out of their so-called engagement in whatever rules you think they should be engaged in, right? And you really want to you keep them to their promise. And if they don't keep their promise, I'm going to freaking force them to, right? No. People should be able to pull out of their engagement no matter what. And so should you as the other part.
They would simply be speaking from either within the institution of promising, as in they endorse promising. And
an institution of promising, what is that? What's an institution? Like you are going to some document somewhere, or some people somewhere, a building somewhere, a combination of all three, and saying this is where the constitution of this promising is. Well, there's no institution, right? You can't point to some institution and say that is what explains it. Now you're referring to something that isn't even an is. You can't, it has to be empirical to exist. And that's what Hume points out. People going from establishing empirical objectivity, right? Not objectivity, existence, like elephant or bicycle or something like that, or say elephant is this position and bicycle is over there, and therefore you should do this, right? But you are pointing to something that can't even exist. An institution, where's that? What color does it have? What sound does it have? What taste does it have? It doesn't have any of these, so it doesn't exist. So you can't even apply Hume's law because there's no is that you can incorrectly derive an ought from, right? So now you are even violating the whole structure of Hume's Isought gap.
And they think that people should, if they do promise, they should follow through with these promises, or even a neutral observer, or maybe a hostile observer, who doesn't personally agree with the institution of promising, but from within the context of what has been laid out, can see that logically, yes, I do have an obligation to do this, and therefore I ought to follow through on it. And so
there's no ought. But where's that ought? Ought is something different than I'm going to do this, right? Ought is something that has another level of doing things. It has a moral content, right? It has sort of, and that's what the hard part to explain, because nobody really knows what morality is, it seems, right? And I won't even claim that I know. But ought in this context is, yes, I made an agreement with somebody, but calling it an ought doesn't mean that it has moral content. But you are, by using the term ought, you are inflicting that morality onto that situation as if that solves the problem. But just using ought or moral terms as you see fit does not mean that you have bridged Hume's Isought gap, right? You're just calling it an ought, or ought in the sense that you're calling it moral contra immoral, whatever the situation is. And thereby saying you have found the morality in it, but you haven't. You haven't pointed to the morality. And that is the deeper truth, or the deeper understanding of what Hume is talking about. In his way of phrasing this comment in his book, he is trying to encompass all ways that people jump this gap, being using words or using threat or using whatever fallacy you can use to establish some kind of ought by using language without pointing to where that ought all of a sudden arrived, right? And what you're also trying to say is that, well, if there's some kind of promise you've made, you have a moral obligation. Okay, but how did that moral part of it, how did that arrive, right? That is what Hume is saying. You're just attaching morality as if you can just go around putting it in wherever you want without explaining how that ought thing, that morality thing appeared, right? And why do you need to attach it? Is another thing you might ask, right? Why do you need to? You could just say, well, you made a promise to me. I'm going to say to you, I will adhere to that promise, and I expect you to adhere to that promise also. Then you avoided the term ought or any kind of moral statement, and then there was no morality. Why do you need to bring in morality? Is it because it has a bigger sort of, there's a bigger club you're pounding in people's face by saying you ought to do it, right? It feels like you're a bad person if you don't do it, right? And that's the effect people want by using morality. That's why morality has been corrupted, because people wanted to control people with it. They don't want to create a morality that is functional. They want to use it as a sledgehammer to manipulate people emotionally to get what they want.
So these are what we could describe as objective or categoric. It doesn't require...
You should define what you mean by objective, because if you experience something, that doesn't mean you have objective experience. What would that mean compared to being subjective? You are a subject experiencing something, and you can say, okay, I have a subjective experience, because you are the subject experiencing whatever it is you're claiming to experience. So from the base point, the starting point, it starts being subjective before it can be objective, right? It has to start with subjective, because there must be some subject experiencing and potentially claiming to experience it towards another individual. But you can't go to another individual and say, what I experience is per definition objective, right? I am experiencing objectivity. You can't do that, right? You have to establish objectivity, right? When something is objective, that is an agreement between two or more individuals about a certain object, a subjective object. If you agree about that subjective experience, you can say that you have an objective experience in the sense that the object is the same for both of you, right? But at the same time, you can't know if the other guy is lying, and the other guy can't know if you're lying. So there's still a problem there with objectivity, right? So mind you, you might want to give a very clear and easy to understand definition of what objectivity is.
And necessarily the people who are involved, the subjective interface from the people who are involved, to be something that can be established from the outside. And so we get more force when we speak from within the institution. If you're someone who is concerned that someone is breaking a promise because it's wrong to break a promise in principle.
Why is it wrong? You keep talking about this. You just talked about what could potentially be something that is, right? It has to be, otherwise we are not talking about Hume's law. So it must be something that is, or something that can exist, which is another way of using the term is. So it must be an object for it to reach objectivity, which is something else you refer to, right? So it must be an object. Otherwise it can't be objective potentially, right? So
then it's very persuasive, and it is a way of shaming someone if they're failing to live up to their promise. And what these are sort of hypothetical imperatives. These are things that exist because of the institutions. They're drawn from the institutions. They aren't merely...
There are no institutions. Can you show me a picture? Can you show me a description, a formula, anything that could that could make me say that is something that exists, is that becomes an ought, right? There has to be some is, right? You can't say there's a is, and then I'm bringing in something that doesn't exist, and therefore that becomes an ought, right? That doesn't work. That's manipulative. That's sophistry.
Abstract categorical imperatives that exist prior to any kind of interaction with the real world. They are a part of the real world. But it seems that, at least in one sense, Hume is wrong. You can actually derive an ought from an is, as I think I've demonstrated, and Mackie had demonstrated.
No, you haven't demonstrated. You have just manipulated words around, talking about things that doesn't exist, which doesn't apply to Hume's Isought gap, or Hume's law, whatever you will, guillotine, or whatever you want to call it. I call it the Isought gap, because there's a gap there that needs to be bridged in order for you to be able to go from is to ought. And you haven't bridged it. You're just, juggling words around, and it make it sound like you're saying something, and people say institutions and whatever. Okay, I guess he might have something, and I'm just stupid, so Benjamin must be right? No, you haven't done it. It's ridiculous.
Demonstrated, really. And the thing is, if he's not wrong, where do we derive our oughts from? Why should anyone do anything? Why is the imperative that is being produced for us and pronounced onto us legitimate?
There's no why. There's no why. There's no why. There's nothing you should do. There's nothing you shouldn't do. What I would be concerned with is a system of morality where people get the consequence they deserve from their action, right? When George Bush sends, thousands of soldiers into their deaths, or Stalin, kills 5 million Ukrainians due to, a lack of food, well, he should receive the consequences of his actions, but he doesn't. They don't. It's the lack of feedback of consequences from your actions that is in a direct measure to your the consequences of your action should be measured according to the action you perform. So you should get the consequences, the full consequences of your actions. If you can get a free abortion paid for by men who are unable to get a girlfriend and have babies, right? But they can be forced to kill babies in women who just sort of got pregnant, right? But these women who get an abortion free of charge and can keep, getting pregnant afterwards and so on, they don't get the consequences they deserve from their action. So they should get the kind of act. If you can, become pregnant and get other people to pay for your sort of potentially bad behavior, or your behavior in any circumstance, then there's a moral hazard, you could say. I think that's what it's called, that you are going to act in a certain way you otherwise wouldn't, because if you got the real consequences of your actions, you would behave differently. And that different kind of action would be more advantageous for people in general than you performing your actions, because you can lease out the bad consequences, right? If you risk end up becoming pregnant unwanted, I'm not telling you. I mean, I don't mind abortions I just think that people should pay for their abortions themselves, or they should set up some kind of charity that helps people get abortions who got pregnant either not by their own choice, but also, like, by having a very loose idea of how they interact sexually with men or with women or whatever it is. I mean, I don't want to pay for other people killing their children, right? Why should I pay for it? I'm forced to pay for something. I'm forced to pay for whatever it is that other people think I should be. So they arrange the work so that they can lease out the bill to me. And with a bill I don't want to pay, but because they can lease out the bill to me, they change their behavior in what should be considered a morally worse way than the way they would act if they couldn't give me the bill, right? Okay, I might want to advise you to go and view my video on Hume's Isought gap, which is, let me see my channel here, and we are closing down Carl Benjamin. I have a video called something like Hume's Isought gap, and explains very thoroughly how I see the idea of Hume's Isought, and I go deep in this one, Hume's Isought gap explained, and Mandibil's law, which is sort of an extension of Hume's Isought, and I urge you to go and listen to that to get further ideas about what we are doing when we are talking Hume's Isought gap. It's a very, very, very important aspect of ethics, which everybody seems to both misunderstand Hume, what he's actually saying, and they are constantly violating what he's saying without actually understanding that that's what they're doing. And Carl Benjamin's video just now was an example of just that. So have a nice day. See you next time.